It was approximately 11:47 p.m. when Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr., the 21-year-old loudmouth from Louisville who'd won Olympic gold and who wouldn't shut up about becoming heavyweight champion of the world, sat alone in his hotel room at the Teresa Hotel on 125th Street in Harlem, holding a tape recorder in his hands and understanding with absolute clarity that his entire future, everything he'd worked for since he was 12 years old and first walked into a boxing gym, was about to be destroyed by voices on magnetic tape that he'd never imagined anyone besides Malcolm X would hear. The two white men in expensive suits who'd visited him 3 hours earlier, who'd played exactly 2 minutes and 17 seconds of a private conversation Clay had believed was protected by friendship and trust, and the simple assumption that when you talked in someone's apartment with the door closed, those words stayed private. Those men had been very clear about what would happen next, about the choice Clay faced, about how a career could end before it properly began if certain recordings reached certain newspapers, certain boxing commissions, certain sponsors who wouldn't tolerate association with the Nation of Islam, with Malcolm X, with anything that white America in 1963 considered dangerous or radical or un-American. "You take a dive against Doug Jones on March 13th, the first man had said, his voice carrying the particular kind of confidence that comes from knowing you hold all the power in a negotiation. Or every newspaper in America gets copies of you and Malcolm X discussing your conversion to Islam, your plan to change your name, your belief that white people are devils, everything the American public needs to know, that Cassius Clay, Olympic hero, is actually a secret Muslim radical who hates his country." The second man had added, almost conversationally, like he was doing Clay a favor by explaining the obvious, "Your career ends tomorrow if these tapes go. He's public. No boxing commission will license you. No sponsor will touch you. You'll be finished before you ever get a title shot. But if you do what we're asking, if you lose to Jones like we need you to lose, then the tapes disappear. Your secret stays secret. You get to keep chasing your championship dreams." They'd left the hotel room, left Clay sitting there processing the mathematics of blackmail, understanding that he was being offered a choice between his principles and his career, between fighting clean and losing everything, or taking a dive and preserving the future he'd been promising since childhood, when he'd started telling anyone who'd listen that he was going to be the greatest heavyweight champion the world had ever seen. Clay sat in that hotel room for approximately 45 minutes after the men left, holding the tape recorder they'd left behind as proof they had what they claimed to have, listening to his own voice discussing things he'd believed were private, hearing Malcolm's voice teaching him about the Nation of Islam, about taking a Muslim name, about rejecting the slave name his ancestors had been given. And Clay understood something fundamental about power in America in 1963, understood that being the best boxer in the world wouldn't protect him from men who had access to technology and leverage and the willingness to destroy someone's life to make money on a fixed fight. But Cassius Clay, despite being young and despite being naive about many things, understood one other thing that the two white men who'd tried to blackmail him apparently didn't understand, which was that Harlem in 1963 had its own power structures, its own hierarchies, its own sources of protection that existed completely outside the legal system and the white-controlled boxing establishment, and that sometimes the only way to fight illegal pressure was with illegal protection. Clay picked up the phone in his hotel room and made a call that would set in motion events the Italian mob hadn't anticipated, consequences they hadn't calculated, and a confrontation between organized crime families that would prove that even in 1963, even in New York City, where the 5 families supposedly controlled everything that mattered, there were still men who couldn't be pushed, still neighborhoods where outside power had limits, still moments when the mathematics of threat and counter-threat produced outcomes that surprised everyone involved. He called the one person in Harlem who Malcolm X had told him could handle problems that couldn't be handled through legal channels, through boxing commissions, through any official avenue that would require Clay to expose the very secret he was trying to protect. He called asking for a meeting with Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson. Bumpy Johnson was 62 years old in March 1963, had spent multiple decades building and maintaining power in Harlem through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, strategic thinking, and an understanding of how informal power structures could be more durable than formal institutions. And he was sitting in the back room of Small's Paradise on 7th Avenue when word reached him that Cassius Clay, the young Olympic champion who'd been spending time with Malcolm X, who was scheduled to fight Doug Jones at Madison Square Garden in less than 2 weeks, needed to speak with him urgently about a situation that apparently couldn't wait until morning. Johnson had heard about Clay, had seen him on television doing his poetry and his predictions, had listened to Malcolm talk about the young fighter with a combination of affection and concern, describing Clay as someone with tremendous potential who was also tremendously naive about how the world worked, about how white power structures would respond once Clay made his conversion to Islam public, about how the boxing establishment would try to control or destroy him once they understood he wasn't going to be the compliant Negro champion they expected. "Send word that I'll meet him at Jock's place in 30 minutes, Johnson told the messenger who delivered Clay's request. "Tell him to come alone. Tell him to be discreet. And tell him that if this is about something trivial, if this is about publicity or about impressing people by meeting Bumpy Johnson, then he's making a mistake that will cost him my goodwill." Johnson arrived at Jock's Place, a restaurant on 145th Street that served as neutral ground where Harlem's various power brokers could meet without territorial complications, at approximately 1:15 a.m., accompanied by Junie Bird, his most trusted lieutenant, and by Theodore Teddy Green, his lawyer and advisor who handled situations that required legal knowledge rather than street knowledge. Cassius Clay arrived at 1:20 a.m., walking into Jock's Place wearing expensive clothes that looked wrong on him somehow, like he was a kid playing dress-up, trying to project confidence and maturity, but not quite pulling it off, and Johnson watched Clay walk across the restaurant toward the back room, watched how other patrons turned to look at the famous young fighter, and Johnson made immediate assessments about character and intelligence based on how someone carried themselves under pressure, how they handled being the center of attention, how they navigated spaces where their celebrity didn't automatically translate to power. Clay entered the back room where Johnson sat at a corner table, and Johnson gestured toward an empty chair without standing up, without offering a handshake, without providing any of the social courtesies that would suggest this was a friendly meeting rather than an evaluation where Clay needed to prove he deserved Johnson's time and attention. "Sit down, Cassius," Johnson said, his voice carrying that particular quiet intensity that made people lean forward to hear him, that made every word seem important because Johnson didn't waste words on things that didn't matter. "You asked to meet with me. You said it was urgent, so talk. Tell me why Bumpy Johnson should care about whatever problem brought you to Harlem at 1 a.m. Clay sat down and for approximately 5 seconds looked uncertain about how to begin, looked like he was calculating how much to reveal, how much to trust this older black man whose reputation included both protection of Harlem's community and ruthless violence against anyone who threatened his interests. And then Clay made a decision that showed more intelligence than Johnson had expected, which was to tell the truth completely and directly without trying to manage the narrative or minimize his own vulnerability. "2 white men came to my hotel room tonight," Clay said, speaking quickly the way he always spoke, words tumbling over each other but maintaining clarity despite the speed. They had recordings of me talking with Malcolm X about converting to Islam, about changing my name, about my plans after I win the heavyweight championship. They said if I don't take a dive in my fight against Doug Jones, they'll release the recordings to the newspapers, to the boxing commissions, to everyone who could destroy my career before I ever get a title shot. Clay pulled the tape recorder from his jacket pocket, set it on the table between himself and Johnson, and continued, "They left this with me as proof they have what they say they have. They want me to lose to Jones because they've bet money on Jones to win, because I'm a 5-1 favorite, and if I lose, they make a fortune, and they're willing to destroy everything I've worked for my whole life to make that happen." Johnson looked at the tape recorder without touching it, looked at Clay's face where fear and anger and desperation were competing for dominance. And Johnson recognized something in that expression that reminded him of younger versions of himself, reminded him of moments when the world's cruelty and injustice became personal rather than abstract, when you understood that systems of power would crush you if you didn't find ways to fight back that the systems didn't anticipate. "Play it," Johnson said, gesturing toward the tape recorder. Clay pressed play, and Johnson listened to approximately 90 seconds of conversation between Clay and Malcolm X, heard Clay's voice expressing doubts about converting publicly, heard Malcolm's voice encouraging him to embrace his faith regardless of consequences, heard discussion of taking the name Muhammad Ali after winning the championship, heard enough to understand that these recordings, if made public in 1963 America, would absolutely destroy Clay's career, would turn him from Olympic hero into dangerous radical in the public imagination, would give boxing commissions and sponsors justification to distance themselves from someone associated with the Nation of Islam. Johnson stopped the tape, sat back in his chair, and spent approximately 30 seconds thinking through implications and options and costs before speaking. "These two white men who came to your hotel room," Johnson said, his voice still quiet, still controlled, "did they tell you who they worked for? Did they mention any names, any organizations?" "No, sir," Clay responded, "but they were Italian. I could tell from their accents, from how they carried themselves. They were made men. I've been around boxing long enough to recognize made men when I see them." Johnson nodded, unsurprised, because the Italian families had controlled boxing in New York for decades, had fixed fights and controlled fighters, and made fortunes manipulating outcomes. And attempting to blackmail a young fighter into taking a dive was exactly the kind of operation the mob had run successfully for years against fighters who lacked the resources or connections to resist. "And you came to me," Johnson said, making it a statement rather than a question, "because Malcolm told you I could help with problems that can't be solved through official channels." "Yes, sir. Malcolm said that if I ever had trouble with people who operated outside the law, that you were the person in Harlem who understood how to handle that kind of trouble." Johnson appreciated Malcolm's discretion in how he'd apparently described Johnson to Clay, appreciated that Malcolm had positioned this as Johnson understanding how to handle illegal problems rather than Johnson being a criminal himself, maintaining plausible deniability while still communicating that Johnson had access to resources and methods that legal authorities couldn't provide. "What exactly are you asking me to do, Cassius?" Johnson asked. "Are you asking me to make these men disappear? Are you asking me to retrieve the recordings? Are you asking me to protect you from retaliation if you refuse their demands? Be specific about what you're requesting, because I need to understand what you think I can provide before I decide whether I'm willing to provide it." Clay looked directly at Johnson, and when he spoke, his voice had lost the quick, playful quality that characterized his public persona, had become serious and measured in ways that suggested he understood the gravity of what he was requesting. I'm asking you to get the recordings back, all of them, every copy they made, and to make sure they can't come after me again, Clay said. I'm not asking you to hurt anyone unless they make that necessary. I'm just asking you to protect me from people trying to destroy my career because they want to make money on a fixed fight. I'll pay whatever that costs. I'll owe you whatever favor you want to collect later. But I can't let them force me to take a dive, Mr. Johnson. I can't let them destroy everything I've worked for because I made the mistake of trusting that a private conversation would stay private. Johnson considered Clay's request, considered the implications of involving himself in a conflict with the Italian families over a boxing match that Johnson had no financial stake in, over a young fighter who wasn't from Harlem and who would probably move on to bigger things and forget about Harlem once he became champion. And Johnson recognized that most rational calculations would suggest declining this request, would suggest telling Clay that this was his problem to solve, that Bumpy Johnson didn't go to war with the Italian mob over other people's troubles. But Johnson also considered what Malcolm had told him about Clay, about the young fighter's potential to become something more than just an athlete, to become a symbol of black pride and resistance, to demonstrate that black men didn't have to accept the roles white America tried to force them into, and Johnson understood that sometimes the value of helping someone had nothing to do with immediate profit and everything to do with supporting the kind of transformation that could matter for the broader community. I'll handle it, Johnson said, making a decision that would set in motion approximately 72 hours of systematic pressure against the Italian family that had made the mistake of trying to fix a fight involving someone Malcolm X cared about, someone Harlem had adopted as temporarily one of their own. But you need to understand several things, Cassius. First, you owe me. You owe me a debt that I'll collect when I need something from you, and you don't get to refuse or negotiate when I call in that debt. Second, you don't talk about this. You don't tell your trainers, you don't tell your friends, you don't tell anyone except Malcolm what happened here tonight or what happens next. Third, you fight Doug Jones the way you were planning to fight him. You win that fight because you're better than him, and you don't let these Italian bastards think they scared you into performing differently than you would have performed without their threats. Clay nodded, accepting all three conditions without hesitation, and Johnson recognized that for all his youth and naivety, Clay understood something important about power and obligation, understood that protection from criminal threats required accepting criminal alliances, understood that Johnson's help came with strings attached that couldn't be cut later just because they became inconvenient. Go back to your hotel, Johnson continued. Train for your fight, act like nothing happened, and Cassius, when you become heavyweight champion, when you take that Muslim name you and Malcolm have been discussing, you remember that Bumpy Johnson believed in you before white America had to accept you. You remember that Harlem protected you when the Italian mob tried to destroy you, and you remember that the power structures that tried to control you through blackmail and threats, those structures will try again in different ways, and you'll need to be stronger and smarter every time they come at you. Clay stood up, extended his hand, and this time Johnson shook it, sealing an agreement that had been negotiated in approximately 15 minutes, but that would shape both men's futures in ways neither of them fully anticipated in that moment. After Clay left Jock's place, Johnson turned to Teddy Green and Junie Bird and began planning the systematic response that would teach the Italian family responsible for threatening Cassius Clay that some targets weren't worth the trouble they caused, that some battles cost more than any potential profit justified, and that Bumpy Johnson's protection, once offered, wasn't something that could be challenged without consequences. Johnson's first priority was identifying exactly which Italian family had authorized the blackmail operation against Clay, which specific individuals had made the recordings and delivered the threats, and where the master recordings and copies were being stored, because retrieving the tapes without knowing their location would be impossible, and retaliating against the wrong family would create complications that Johnson wanted to avoid. Theodore Green made initial inquiries through his connections in the legal community, through lawyers who represented both legitimate businesses and criminal enterprises, through people who heard things and shared information when properly motivated. And within 12 hours, Green had identified that the blackmail operation was being run by associates of the Genovese crime family, specifically by Vincent the Chin Gigante, who controlled various operations in Greenwich Village and who had been expanding into boxing-related gambling in ways that required the ability to control fight outcomes through threats or bribes or violence. Gigante was known as intelligent, ruthless, and politically connected, someone who'd survived multiple attempts by law enforcement to prosecute him, someone who understood how to insulate himself from direct involvement in crimes while maintaining control over operations through intermediaries, and discovering that Gigante was behind the Clay blackmail told Johnson that this situation required careful strategy rather than simple intimidation, required methods that would make Gigante conclude that backing down was smarter than escalating. Junie Bird handled the street-level investigation, using Johnson's network of informants and associates throughout Harlem and Manhattan to track the two men who'd visited Clay's hotel room, to identify where they worked, where they lived, where they spent time, and most importantly, where they might have stored the recordings they'd used to threaten Clay. By the second day after Clay's meeting with Johnson, Bird had located the social club on Sullivan Street in Greenwich Village, where Gigante conducted business, had identified the two enforcers who'd delivered the blackmail threat to Clay, and had learned through a bartender who worked at the club and who was willing to share information in exchange for Johnson's protection from gambling debts he owed, that Gigante kept valuable materials, including recordings used for blackmail operations, in a safe in his private office at the social club. Johnson assembled his response team, 6 men who'd worked with him for years, who understood how to conduct operations that required precision rather than just violence, who could be trusted to follow instructions exactly and to never discuss what they'd participated in regardless of pressure from law enforcement or from anyone else. And Johnson gave them specific instructions about what needed to happen and what limits they needed to observe. "We're not going to war with the Genovese family," Johnson told his team during a planning session at his apartment in Harlem. "War is expensive and unpredictable and creates problems that last for years. What we're doing is retrieving property that doesn't belong to Gigante, correcting a situation where the Italian mob made a mistake by targeting someone under our protection, and delivering a message that the cost of continuing this operation exceeds any profit they might make from fixing the Clay Jones fight." Johnson's plan had multiple components that would be executed simultaneously over a 36-hour period, applying pressure from different directions in ways that would make Gigante understand he faced a coordinated response rather than random trouble. First, the 2 enforcers who'd visited Clay would be intercepted and educated about the mistake they'd made. Not killed, because killing made men would trigger retaliation that Johnson wanted to avoid, but hurt in ways that would communicate serious consequences while staying below the threshold that would require the Genovese family to respond with violence. Second, several of Gigante's operations in Greenwich Village would experience unexpected problems. Gambling locations would be raided by police who suddenly developed information about illegal activities. Truck hijacking operations would find that their fences were no longer willing to purchase stolen goods. Protection rackets would discover that businesses under their control had found alternative protection that made paying Gigante unnecessary. Third, and most important, the recordings would be retrieved through a break-in at Gigante's social club, conducted with sufficient professionalism that Gigante would know this wasn't amateur work, that someone with resources and capabilities had targeted him specifically, that continuing the conflict would mean facing an opponent who could reach him even in places he considered secure. The two enforcers who'd threatened Cassius Clay, Anthony "Tony Boy" Marciano, and Vincent Colucci, left the social club on Sullivan Street at approximately 11:30 p.m. on March 10th, walking toward Marciano's car parked 3 blocks away, discussing their plans for attending the Clay-Jones fight in 3 days, where they expected to watch Clay take a dive, and to collect their share of the profits from bets placed on Jones to win. They reached Marciano's car, a black Cadillac that Marciano had purchased with money from successful shakedown operations, and as Marciano unlocked the driver's side door, 4 men materialized from the shadows between parked cars, moving with coordinated precision that suggested military training or extensive experience conducting operations that required speed and surprise. Junie Bird stepped forward while the other 3 men positioned themselves to prevent Marciano or Colucci from running or fighting back, and Bird spoke in a voice that was conversational rather than threatening, delivering information rather than making dramatic speeches. "Tony, Vincent, we need to have a conversation about Cassius Clay," Bird said. "About the recordings you used to threaten him, about the dive you demanded he take, about the mistake you made in targeting someone under Bumpy Johnson's protection." Marciano, who'd spent 15 years working for the Genovese family and who'd participated in dozens of shakedowns and beatings and intimidation operations, understood immediately that this wasn't a random mugging, that these men knew who he was and what he'd done, and that whatever happened next would be unpleasant regardless of how he responded. "I don't know what you're talking about," Marciano said, maintaining plausible deniability even though everyone present knew he was lying. "I don't know any Cassius Clay. I think you got the wrong guys." Bird nodded to one of his associates, a large man named Wallace, who specialized in delivering precise amounts of violence calibrated to communicate messages without causing permanent injury. And Wallace stepped forward and broke Marciano's left hand with a collapsible baton, 2 quick strikes that fractured multiple bones, while avoiding hitting Marciano's head or torso in ways that might cause serious injury. Marciano screamed, dropped to his knees, clutching his shattered hand, and Bird continued speaking in the same conversational tone. "Let me explain how this works, Tony. You and Vincent visited Cassius Clay's hotel room. You played recordings of him talking with Malcolm X. You demanded he take a dive in his fight against Doug Jones. You made threats about destroying his career if he didn't cooperate. All of that happened. We know it happened because Clay told us it happened, and because we've confirmed it through other sources. So we're not negotiating about facts. We're negotiating about consequences." Colucci, watching his partner writhe on the ground, made a calculation about survival versus loyalty and decided survival was more important. "Look, we were just doing a job," Colucci said, his voice shaking. "Chin told us to lean on the fighter to make sure he understood taking a dive was good for his health. We didn't know Clay was connected to anyone in Harlem. We were just following orders." "And now you're going to follow different orders," Bird responded. "You're going to go back to Chin and tell him that the Clay operation is finished. You're going to explain that the recordings need to be destroyed, that any bets placed on Jones to win need to be written off as losses, and that continuing to target Clay will result in escalating problems that make tonight look gentle. You're going to communicate all of that clearly and accurately, and then you're going to pray that Chin is smart enough to accept reality rather than trying to save face by retaliating." Bird gestured to Wallace, who broke Colucci's left hand with the same precise efficiency he'd used on Marciano, and both enforcers were left on the street next to Marciano's Cadillac, injured but alive, carrying a message that would reach Gigante within hours, and that would force Gigante to decide whether continuing the Clay blackmail operation was worth the escalating conflict with Bumpy Johnson. While Marciano and Colucci were being intercepted and educated about the costs of threatening people under Johnson's protection, a separate team led by Johnson's most skilled break-in specialist, a man known simply as Raymond, who'd spent 20 years conducting burglaries that were never solved because Raymond understood how to defeat alarm systems, open safes, and avoid leaving evidence that could be traced back to him, was preparing to enter Gigante's social club and retrieve the recordings that represented the only leverage the Genovese family had over Cassius Clay. Raymond had spent the previous 36 hours studying the social club's layout, identifying security measures, determining optimal entry and exit routes, and planning the operation with the kind of methodical attention to detail that separated professionals from amateurs. That meant the difference between clean operations and disasters that ended with arrests or violence. The social club closed at 2 a.m., and by 2:15 a.m., the last employees and patrons had left, leaving only the building's alarm system and a safe in Gigante's private office protecting the materials Raymond needed to retrieve. Raymond entered through a rear delivery entrance that had a lock he could pick in under 30 seconds, disabled the alarm system using techniques he'd learned from a former police alarm technician who now worked as a consultant for criminals who paid better than the NYPD, and moved through the darkened social club toward Gigante's office with confidence that came from having conducted hundreds of similar operations without ever being caught. The safe in Gigante's office was a commercial model that would resist amateur attempts to crack it, but that Raymond could open in approximately 8 minutes using a combination of manipulation techniques and listening devices that detected the sound of tumblers falling into place. Raymond opened the safe at 2:47 a.m., found the master reel-to-reel tape of Clay's conversations with Malcolm X, along with 3 copies that had been made for distribution to newspapers if Gigante decided to follow through on his threats, and removed all 4 tapes while leaving everything else in the safe untouched, because taking only the Clay recordings would send a clear message that this wasn't a random burglary, but a targeted retrieval. Raymond left a note inside the safe, typewritten to avoid handwriting analysis, that read, "The Clay operation ends tonight. Further attempts to blackmail or threaten him will result in consequences that escalate beyond broken hands and retrieved recordings. This is business, not war. Choose wisely. BJ." Raymond exited the social club the same way he'd entered, reset the alarm system so Gigante would find everything apparently secure when he arrived the next morning, and by 3:15 a.m. had delivered all 4 recordings to Johnson at his apartment in Harlem, completing the operation with the kind of professional efficiency that Johnson valued above almost every other quality in people who worked for him. Vincent the Chin Gigante arrived at his social club on 8 Sullivan Street at approximately 10:30 a.m. on March 12th, was informed by his secretary that the alarm system showed no signs of having been breached, but that she'd noticed his office door was slightly ajar, which was unusual because Gigante always locked it when he left, and Gigante entered his office to find everything apparently normal, except that his safe, which should have been locked, was hanging open. Gigante checked the safe's contents methodically, found that approximately $30,000 in cash was untouched, found that various documents related to his legitimate and illegal businesses were exactly where he'd left them, and found that the only items missing were the 4 reel-to-reel tapes containing recordings of Cassius Clay's conversations with Malcolm X, the tapes that represented his leverage over Clay, his ability to force Clay to take a dive in the upcoming fight against Doug Jones. The note left inside the safe confirmed what Gigante had already suspected after Marciano and Colucci had reported their encounter with Johnson's people the previous night, which was that Bumpy Johnson had decided to involve himself in the Clay situation, had used methods that demonstrated he had capabilities and resources that Gigante had underestimated, and was offering Gigante a choice between accepting the loss of the Clay operation or escalating into a conflict that would cost more than any profit from fixing one boxing match. Gigante spent the next 2 hours making phone calls, consulting with other Genovese family leaders, discussing options for responding to Johnson's challenge, and ultimately arriving at the conclusion that most experienced criminals reach when faced with conflicts that offer high costs and uncertain benefits, that walking away while maintaining dignity was smarter than fighting for principle when principle wouldn't pay the bills or protect their operations from unnecessary law enforcement attention. The mathematics were simple. Gigante had invested approximately $20,000 in surveillance equipment and payoffs to the people who'd helped him obtain the recordings of Clay and Malcolm X. He'd placed bets totaling $150,000 on Doug Jones to win, expecting to profit approximately $400,000 when Clay took the dive. Losing those potential profits was expensive and annoying, but not catastrophic. Fighting Bumpy Johnson, on the other hand, would cost substantially more. Johnson had demonstrated he could hurt Gigante's enforcers, compromise Gigante's operations through police raids and business disruptions, and penetrate Gigante's security to steal from his safe without triggering alarms or leaving evidence. Escalating the conflict would mean dedicating resources to attacking Johnson's operations in Harlem, which would be difficult and expensive because Johnson had home territory advantage and community support that white mobsters couldn't match. More importantly, escalating would draw attention from law enforcement, would create opportunities for federal prosecutors who were always looking for ways to build RICO cases against organized crime families, would generate the kind of publicity that made legitimate businesses nervous about associations with people who were publicly engaged in gang warfare. Gigante called a meeting with his key advisors, presented the situation, laid out the costs and benefits of different responses, and after approximately 90 minutes of discussion, arrived at a consensus that accepting the loss of the Clay operation was the least bad option available. "We let it go," Gigante announced. "We write off the money we spent on surveillance. We cancel the bets on Jones, take the losses. We put out word that Clay is off limits, that anyone who tries to fix his fights or pressure him answers to me personally. And we send a message to Bumpy Johnson that we're accepting his terms this time, but that this doesn't establish precedent for him interfering in our operations outside Harlem." One of Gigante's captains, a man named Dominic Russo, who'd been involved in organized crime since the 1930s and who understood that survival required knowing when to fight and when to retreat, nodded his approval. "Bumpy Johnson isn't worth going to war over one fighter," Russo said. "He's connected in Harlem in ways we can't match. He's got relationships with corrupt guaps we can't buy. He's got community loyalty that makes him dangerous on his home territory. We try to hit him in Harlem. We lose more than we gain. Better to let him have this victory, maintain our operations in our own territories, And remember for next time that some targets cost more than they're worth. Gigante accepted Russo's assessment, made a phone call to Theodore Green requesting a meeting to formalize the resolution of the dispute, and by the evening of March 12th, approximately 60 hours after Cassius Clay had sat in Johnson's presence at Jock's place asking for help, the conflict had been settled without war, without deaths, with nothing more than broken hands and stolen recordings, and an understanding between criminal organizations that some boundaries wouldn't be crossed regardless of potential profits. Cassius Clay entered the ring at Madison Square Garden on March 13, 1963, to fight Doug Jones with no blackmail hanging over him, no threats forcing him to perform at anything less than his best, no recordings that could be released to destroy his career if he won the way he'd promised he would win. Johnson didn't attend the fight personally, had no interest in being photographed at Madison Square Garden, where newspaper coverage might create questions about why Harlem's most famous criminal was watching a boxing match. But Junie Bird was there, sitting in the crowd, watching Clay perform against Jones, with the understanding that if anything unusual happened during or after the fight, if Gigante's people tried some last-minute retaliation, or if Clay faced any trouble that suggested the Genovese family hadn't honored their agreement to leave him alone, then the conflict would resume with escalating intensity. Clay won by unanimous decision after 10 rounds, maintaining his undefeated record despite Jones proving tougher than expected, and after the fight, Clay found his way to where Bird was waiting near the locker rooms. "Mr. Johnson wanted me to tell you congratulations," Bird said quietly, "and to remind you that you owe him. He'll collect that debt when the time comes. You understand?" "I understand," Clay replied. "Tell Mr. Johnson I'll never forget what he did for me. Tell him that when I become champion, when I take the name Muhammad Ali and show the world that a black Muslim can be the greatest fighter alive, I'll remember that Bumpy Johnson believed in me before white America had to accept me." Bird nodded and left, his presence at the fight fulfilling Johnson's instruction to observe and protect, but not to become part of Clay's public story, and Clay returned to his locker room to celebrate with his trainers and handlers who never learned about the blackmail that had almost destroyed Clay's career before the fight even happened, who never knew that the mob had tried to force Clay to take a dive, who never understood that Bumpy Johnson had gone to war with the Italian families to protect a fighter who wasn't even from Harlem. 3 months after the Doug Jones fight, after Clay had continued training for his eventual championship bout against Sonny Liston, after Malcolm X had continued teaching Clay about the Nation of Islam and preparing him for the controversy that would come when Clay publicly converted, Cassius Clay returned to Harlem for a charity event organized by Malcolm, a fundraiser for local schools that needed books and supplies and other resources that New York City's government wasn't providing to black neighborhoods. Clay agreed to attend, to sign autographs, to be the celebrity draw that would attract crowds and media attention and donations, and during the event at the Abyssinian Baptist Church on West 138th Street, Clay saw Johnson standing in the back of the room, watching the crowd, observing Clay interact with children who saw him as a hero, and Clay understood that Johnson's presence wasn't coincidental, that Johnson was there to collect something beyond money, to establish something beyond immediate payback for the help he'd provided. Clay worked the crowd for approximately 90 minutes, shook hands, signed programs, posed for photographs, played the role of the charismatic champion in waiting that made him famous, and then excused himself and walked to where Johnson stood, away from the crowds, away from the reporters who might photograph them together and create unwanted questions about relationships between the young Olympic champion and Harlem's most notorious criminal. "Mr. Johnson," Clay said, extending his hand with genuine respect rather than the performative friendliness he showed to cameras and crowds. "I never properly thanked you for what you did. Those recordings, if they'd gotten out before I was ready, they would have destroyed everything." Johnson shook Clay's hand, his grip firm but not aggressive, and looked at Clay with the kind of assessing gaze that evaluated character rather than celebrity, that measured what someone was rather than what they appeared to be. "You won your fight," Johnson said. "That's thanks enough for the immediate problem. But the reason I came tonight, Cassius, is to talk about the bigger problem. The problem that doesn't end with one set of recordings being destroyed or one mob family being warned to back off. What problem is that? The problem of being a black man who white America wants to control. You think the Genovese family was the last group who'll try to leverage you, blackmail you, force you into doing what serves their interests instead of yours. You think boxing commissions won't try to deny you licenses if you convert to Islam? You think sponsors won't drop you if you take a Muslim name? You think the government won't put you under surveillance the same way they surveil Malcolm?" Clay nodded slowly, understanding that Johnson was describing not hypothetical future troubles, but inevitable ones, that the path Clay had chosen, becoming Muhammad Ali, joining the Nation of Islam, refusing to be the compliant Negro champion white America expected, would create opposition that would make the gigante blackmail look simple by comparison. "I know it won't be easy," Clay said, "but I'm not going to let fear stop me from being who I really am. I'm going to beat Liston. I'm going to become champion. I'm going to take the name Muhammad Ali. And I'm going to show the world that a black Muslim can be the greatest fighter who ever lived. Let them try to stop me." Johnson smiled, and Clay recognized that expression as approval, as Johnson recognizing something in Clay that reminded him of his younger self, that combination of courage and defiance that made someone willing to fight battles that more cautious people would avoid. "Good," Johnson said, "because the world needs people who won't back down just because backing down is safer. The world needs people who'll stand up even when standing up costs them everything. But Cassius, you need to understand something Malcolm probably hasn't told you yet, because Malcolm thinks in terms of moral principles rather than street survival." "What's that?" "The name Muhammad Ali, when you take it, won't just be words. It'll be power, power that comes from you, from your faith, from your conviction, power that white people can't give you and can't take away. But that power also makes you a target, makes you dangerous to people who want black Americans to stay in the roles white society assigns us. So when you become Muhammad Ali, when you win that championship, you remember what I'm about to tell you." Johnson leaned closer, his voice dropping to the quiet intensity that made every word feel important. "Power respects power. The government, the mob, the boxing establishment, but all of them only respect power. They don't respect begging. They don't respect asking nicely. They respect strength, resources, and willingness to fight back. When they come after you, and they will come after you, you don't appeal to their better nature because they don't have one. You make them understand that attacking you costs more than leaving you alone. You build alliances with people who have power. You maintain resources they can't touch. You never let them see you afraid, like you did with the Italians. You made Gigante understand that coming after me cost more than the profit from fixing one fight." "Exactly. And you need to apply that same principle to every challenge you face. When the Boxing Commission tries to deny you a license, you make their refusal so controversial, so publicly embarrassing, that granting the license becomes easier than defending their discrimination. When sponsors drop you, you build your own economic power so you don't depend on white corporations deciding whether you're acceptable. When the government surveils you, you speak so publicly, so boldly, that trying to silence you draws more attention than letting you speak. Clay listened, absorbing lessons that weren't taught in boxing gyms or mosques, lessons about power and survival that came from Johnson's decades of navigating systems designed to destroy people who challenged them. And Clay understood that what Johnson was offering wasn't just advice, but mentorship, wasn't just information, but wisdom that could mean the difference between becoming a symbol and becoming a cautionary tale. I understand, Mr. Johnson, and I promise you I won't forget what you taught me. When I'm champion, when people try to control me or silence me or force me back into the box they want to keep me in, I'll remember that power respects power, and I'll make sure I have enough power that they have to respect me whether they want to or not. Johnson nodded, satisfied that his message had been received and understood, and then shifted to the immediate purpose of their conversation, to collecting the debt that Clay owed, not for Johnson's personal benefit, but for the broader purpose that had motivated Johnson's intervention in the first place. The debt you owe me, Cassius, I'm going to collect it now, not later. And what I want from you is simple. When you become champion, when you're famous and powerful and everyone wants your attention, you remember Harlem. You come back to this community, you support the people here, you use your platform to speak about issues that matter to Black Americans who don't have your platform. You don't become one of those athletes who makes money and moves to white neighborhoods and forgets where he came from. I won't forget, Mr. Johnson, I promise you that. Promises are easy. Actions matter. So here's how you'll prove it. After you win the championship, you come back to Harlem and you spend a day at the Abyssinian Baptist Church working with kids, showing them that success doesn't mean abandoning your community. You use your voice to support causes that help Harlem, that help Black communities across America. And when you have opportunities to make money through endorsements or appearances or whatever comes with being champion, you make sure some of that money flows back to places like Harlem that supported you when you needed support. Clay extended his hand again, sealing the agreement with a handshake that bound him to obligations that went beyond legal contracts, that created responsibilities that couldn't be enforced in courts, but that mattered more than any formal document because they were based on honor and respect rather than legal mechanisms. I'll do all of that, Mr. Johnson. You have my word, and my word means something. I believe it does, Johnson replied. Now get back to your crowd. Those kids came to see the future heavyweight champion of the world. Don't disappoint them. The championship, February 1964. Cassius Clay defeated Sonny Liston on February 25, 1964, shocking the world by defeating the heavily favored champion, and the next day announced his conversion to Islam and his new name, Muhammad Ali, creating exactly the kind of controversy that Johnson had predicted, triggering exactly the kind of opposition from boxing commissions and sponsors and media that Johnson had warned would come. But Ali, armed with lessons learned from Johnson about power and survival, about never backing down, about making opposition cost more than accommodation, navigated that controversy with the combination of defiance and strategic thinking that would define his career, becoming not just a champion, but a symbol of resistance against systems that tried to control him. Johnson watched Ali's transformation from a distance, watched the young fighter become Muhammad Ali, watched him face opposition from the government and the boxing establishment and white America generally, watched him maintain his principles despite costs that would have broken weaker men, and Johnson recognized that his intervention in March 1963, his decision to go to war with the Genovese family over 4 recordings that could have destroyed a young fighter's career, had mattered in ways that extended beyond one person's success. Because Muhammad Ali, champion and symbol and voice of black pride, existed partly because Bumpy Johnson had protected Cassius Clay during a vulnerable moment, had demonstrated that power could be used for purposes beyond profit, had shown that criminal resources could serve community interests when wielded by someone who understood that personal power meant nothing if the community remained powerless. The legacy. Bumpy Johnson died on July 7, 1968, 4 years after helping save Muhammad Ali's career, never seeing the full scope of how Ali would transform from athlete to global icon, never witnessing Ali stand against the Vietnam War, never watching Ali become the symbol of resistance and principle that Johnson had believed he could become. But in the years between 1964 and 1968, Ali made good on his promise to Johnson, returning to Harlem multiple times, working with youth programs at Abyssinian Baptist Church, speaking publicly about issues affecting black communities, using his platform in ways that honored the debt he owed to the man who'd protected him when protection mattered most. And after Johnson's death, Ali told the story selectively, carefully, to people who understood that some debts transcend individual relationships, that some obligations continue even after the person you owe has died, and Ali continued supporting Harlem and black communities across America, partly because that's who he was, but also partly because he'd promised Bumpy Johnson he would, and Muhammad Ali didn't break promises to people who'd saved his life. The story of how Bumpy Johnson saved Muhammad Ali's name, how a Harlem criminal went to war with the Italian mob to protect a young fighter most people had never heard of, became legend in certain circles, whispered about in barber shops and social clubs, told as an example of what real power looked like, of how protecting community mattered more than personal profit, of how one man's decision to help someone who asked for help changed American history in ways that the Genovese family could never have predicted when they made the mistake of trying to blackmail Cassius Clay. The recordings that Vincent Gigante had obtained, the tapes that could have destroyed Clay's career before it properly began, were destroyed by Johnson personally, burned in his apartment while Teddy Green and Junie bird-watched, ensuring that no copies existed that could be used later, that the threat was eliminated completely rather than just postponed. And on the night of February 25, 1964, when Cassius Clay became heavyweight champion by defeating Sonny Liston, when he announced to the world that he was Muhammad Ali, when he embraced the identity that would make him one of the most famous people on earth. Johnson sat in his apartment in Harlem and smiled, knowing that the young fighter he'd protected had fulfilled the potential Johnson had seen in him, had become the symbol of black pride and resistance that Malcolm X had believed he could become, had proven that power used wisely could change the world in ways that power used selfishly never could. That was how Bumpy Johnson saved Muhammad Ali's name, not through violence, though he'd been willing to use violence if necessary, not through money, though he'd spent resources protecting Ali that he'd never recoup, but through understanding that some battles matter more than others, that some people deserve protection even when protecting them costs you, and that power means nothing if it's not used to help people who can't protect themselves. The doorman at the Cotton Club had learned that lesson in 1935 when Johnson had responded to being turned away, not with immediate violence, but with systematic economic warfare that forced integration. Vincent Gigante had learned that lesson in 1963 when Johnson had responded to threats against Cassius Clay, not with gang war, but with targeted pressure that made continuing the blackmail operation more expensive than abandoning it. And Muhammad Ali had learned that lesson from both Johnson and Malcolm X, had learned that being powerful meant using that power for more than personal gain, meant standing up for principles, even when standing up cost everything, meant refusing to back down, even when backing down would have been easier and safer and more profitable. That was Bumpy Johnson's real legacy, not the criminal empire he built, not the wealth he accumulated, not even the protection he provided to Harlem for decades, but the lesson he taught through actions more than words, that power without principle is just bullying, that strength without purpose is just violence, and that the only thing that matters in the end is whether you used whatever power you had to make the world slightly better than it would have been without you. Muhammad Ali understood that lesson, lived that lesson, became that lesson, and it started in March 1963 when a frightened young fighter knocked on Bumpy Johnson's door asking for help, and Johnson said yes.